Good morning, everyone. Today we have with us Ashish Kulkarni, sir, Assistant Professor at Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, and a visiting faculty at SIDTM. The topic for the day is economic recovery post COVID-19. So first, I would like to thank you, sir, for taking this opportunity and enlightening us with your knowledge. So thanks a lot for that, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I believe we can dive right in. So before we actually begin, I do have that question. What exactly is this post COVID-19, or is there something called as post COVID-19? Because we keep seeing the new variants every 6 months or so. So what are your thoughts on that, sir?
I think these days it's important to begin with an explanation of what I'm capable of answering and what I'm not. And I'm very much an economist, not an epidemiologist. So whatever I say about this, the question you asked should be taken with a pinch of salt. But that being said, my best guess for having read whatever little I have about COVID, I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think it's going to become a part of the world that we live in. Hopefully, fingers crossed, won't be as serious, as threatening, or as widespread as it is right now. So I don't think there's ever going to be a post-COVID world, and I hope I'm wrong about that. But I think there will be a post "don't take COVID so seriously" world. We will just simply learn to live with the virus rather than quote unquote defeat it or eradicate it altogether.
Uh, right, sir. A follow-up question towards that. But
Mhm.
then we keep seeing lockdowns every 6 months or so. What kind of impact do we foresee in the future? I mean, like currently we are under a lockdown now, and we were under lockdown a couple of months ago, and the same thing happened a year ago, and so. What are your thoughts on that, sir? Like, is this the way to go, and what kind of impact do you foresee to this towards this the economy that we have currently?
So long as the variants are not more severe than the ones that we have seen so far, in my limited knowledge, Delta was by far and away the worst that India has seen, but other countries seem to suffer either the same or slightly lesser where Omicron is concerned. But even with the same intensity, and now that vaccinations are widely available, I don't think lockdowns will be quite as bad as they were in 2020 or even 2021. There might be restrictions on movement in the future, but the kind of widespread and very strict lockdowns that we've seen, that has to be a thing of the past. And the reason I say it has to be a thing of the past is because we're paying a very high economic price. And I don't think anybody, not just in this country, but the world over, is willing to accept such a high price to be paid for trying to control the spread of COVID. So we're going to have to learn to live with it whether we like it or not.
Sure, sir. Thanks for that. Again, I do have another question where it was recently projected that Indian economy is projected to grow at 9.2% as per the latest report by NSO. Your views on this, sir? Are we on the right track? How we could actually, achieve this, and whether we can sustain this momentum in the forthcoming fiscals as well?
Are we on the right track is a difficult question to answer for two reasons. One, because the data is still too new, and second, because COVID hasn't ended. I think most of the growth that we're seeing right now is, in a sense, a bounce back effect of the low growth over the last 2 years or so, which is not either a criticism or praise for not just the Indian economy, but in general, the global economy. The world as a whole is just recovering from the last 2 years. Is that recovery going to be one, even, and B, is it going to be equitable? That is everybody going to recover at the same rate? Is, I think, what we have to keep an eye out for. So more than asking the question about whether the recovery is sustainable or not, a crucial question to answer is about whether the economic recovery is going to be equitable, and by that I mean everybody recovering at the same rate. And I don't think that is going to happen. I think we're going to see, unfortunately, what most economists refer to as a K-shaped recovery, which in effect means that some of our population is going to recover very rapidly, very quickly, but others might not recover, let alone recover, but they might actually struggle to even be where they find themselves either now or in the previous year. And that is where I think fiscal policy has a very important role to play in terms of not redistribution per se, but support for those sections of society that are not able to recover quickly. So, stressed balance sheets for households, the inability to find jobs post the end of the pandemic, and adjusting to the new nature of jobs is going to require a lot of help, both from think tanks and policymakers, but also from the government. And that is the $1 million question. How well we do this is a severe test of our economic resilience in the years to come.
Right, sir. So you mentioned K-shaped recovery. Are we actually seeing K-shaped recovery now? I mean, yeah.
two ways to interpret that. One, by definition, GDP will give us only an aggregate picture, and then it makes sense to take a look at other indicators of the economy to try and figure out whether we are recovering well. And that could be a whole host of things. Take a look at, say, for example, whether automobile sales are going up, and you will find that they are beginning to recover. But even once you begin to dig into the details of automobile sales, are car sales up? Yes. Are two-wheeler sales up? Not quite so much. What does that tell us about urban versus rural divides? Is a crucial question. So I think the skill of not just economists but economic students will be in terms of trying to figure out which metrics or which indicators could help us understand the nature of the recovery. Just GDP alone will not do it. Just studying the formal sector of the Indian economy will not do it. I think all of us are going to have to learn how to be better students of India's informal economy. And that's both a problem in the short run, but also an opportunity in the medium to long run. We need to get better at collecting data from all parts of India, not just the formal parts.
So yes, sir. You mentioned manufacturing. So India recently rolled out that PLI scheme of 1.97 crores.
Mhm.
So how do you see this benefiting the economy and in the longer run? The point in case being, Elon Musk recently tweeted that he's still facing challenges with the Indian government, and there was this big, political uproar and all of that. Let's not get into politics, but do you see, I mean, such things happening, and even then, how will it impact the foreign investors' basic perspective towards India? I mean, so in a broader perspective.
I remain cautiously optimistic about PLI and any schemes of a similar nature. I'll explain the use of both words, cautious and optimism. Optimism because anything that helps us in India produce more, both for domestic consumption, but much more importantly for exports, is a wonderful thing. And PLI is a good start in that regard. Cautious because of two things. One, because we have a very long history in this country of having announced schemes, but they tend to not have worked out for a variety of reasons. And I hope PLI isn't one of these sort of schemes that get announced with a lot of fanfare, but not much on the ground implementation happens. And therefore, one reason for caution. And the second reason is because it's very much a function of the quality of the bureaucracy that will actually work with such schemes. Politicians announcing them, industrialists praising them is one thing. But when on the ground, representatives of these industrialists meet the bureaucracy, things tend to not work out well in practice. State capacity is a major factor that holds back the development of our nation, and so therefore caution. So I am hopeful, but I would give it slightly more than 50% chance of succeeding, but not much more than that, and I would be very happy to be wrong.
Sure, sir. Thanks for that, sir. No, well, again, this again, when you look at the broader perspective, this is again a part of China plus one policy which India hopes to achieve. So again,
Mhm.
where do you think we are with that? Because we do see Mexico and other smaller countries, I mean, coming up. So how do you think will India, actually achieve this, the whole broader perspective of China plus one? So your thoughts on that,
Right.
sir?
There, the question becomes much more tricky because it's not so much about how good or bad our own schemes are, but about how good or bad our schemes are in relation to how good or bad other countries' schemes and already existing infrastructure is. And so I don't see India being the biggest beneficiary of the so-called China plus one strategy. I would argue smaller ASEAN nations, and if you include Vietnam within the ASEAN nations, the nations within ASEAN and Vietnam are going to benefit a little bit more in the short run. The success of both the PLI, our ability to upgrade our bureaucracy, our ability to provide an enabling, supporting infrastructure around the PLI scheme, is what in the medium run might help us gain some advantage relative to other nations. But right now, I don't think we're going to be the biggest beneficiary. We will be in consideration, but I don't think we are the number one pick for many nations if they are going to adopt a China plus one strategy.
Sure. Thanks for that. I do have some, Brett, we keep reading about Pakistan and Sri Lanka, how they are, actually facing this economic crisis as such. What are the
Right.
lessons that can be learned? I mean, from an Indian perspective towards what's really happening with these two countries. So your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, I think the question can more usefully be asked or flipped around by framing it in terms of what Pakistan and Sri Lanka should have learned from the administration of the Indian economy. So, anybody who's attended my classes is more or less familiar with how often I critique what India gets wrong. But here in this case, I think Sri Lanka and Pakistan have gotten much more wrong. And the lessons are not so much for India's policymakers, the lessons are for the policymakers from both of these countries about what to avoid.
Right.
Whether it is political stability, whether it is a better structure of rule and law, whether it is better defined property rights where Pakistan is concerned. And that I think is something that would go a long way towards helping Pakistani economy get better. And in Sri Lanka's case, I think just is a case of one bad management when it comes to agricultural policy and over reliance on tourism and a massive overhang of external debts. Each of these are lessons that Indians or Indian policymakers would have had to worry about 30 to 40 years ago. But right now, I think the only lesson, if at all, that we can learn is make sure we don't repeat the mistakes that the Pakistani and Sri Lankan counterparts did. But for both of these nations, they are going through a severe economic crisis, and it's not good news for the relatively poor people in both of these nations. So it's, if anything, a humanitarian crisis that we should try and figure out how we can help in regards to both of these nations. And speaking of neighbors, I would argue Afghanistan's problems are actually much more severe than our Pakistan's or Sri Lanka's. That nation is quite literally running out of food and foreign exchange. So if there is a crisis in our neighborhood that needs immediate addressing, it is Afghanistan more than Pakistan or Sri Lanka.
Sure, sir. Thanks for that. Uh, well, yes, I mean, the billion-dollar question. I mean, we do keep seeing a lot of unicorns. I mean, this year, I mean, we did have the Paytm thing. So, do you feel are these valuations overbloated? And even as a retail investor, I mean, that is how we follow the hype.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? I mean, what are your views on this? I mean, just wanted to understand.
Morgan Housel had a fantastic post out, came out a couple of days ago, and the theme of the post is effectively statistics versus stories. And the reason I bring up that post is because it's one thing to analyze all IPOs that have been released in the last couple of years on the basis of their statistics. कि इतना PE है, this is what their price to book ratio is, or whatever metric you want to use. And if you use these metrics, then no valuation looks reasonable. Paytm has been a disaster, and that's a well-known story. But if you analyze Zomato using cold hard numbers, you would not be able to justify the kind of valuations and the kind of valuations that have resulted since. But that is where I think Morgan's point comes into play. It is a story that we are selling ourselves in terms of what is great about Paytm, what is great about Zomato, what is great about Nykaa, or any of the other IPOs that are released. And Indians are excited about the story that Zomato is associated with, the narrative that Zomato has, in a sense, either captured or is close to capturing the delivery space, the rating space, and figuring out how to build out the backend is an exciting story. The valuations are not justified. The sentiment in the story is quite another, well, story. And that is the one that I think more Indians are relying on. So I personally remain a little bit bearish about each of the stocks that have had IPOs in the last couple of years. But I know I'm very much in a minority. Most people seem to be more excited than pessimistic.
Right, sir. But yeah, and in a broader perspective, do these actually help in creating more jobs and reducing the unemployment? Can unicorns actually do achieve that? I mean, that is how we and the nation we can actually succeed. So, what are your thoughts on that, sir? Because the numbers,
Absolutely.
yeah,
If
yeah.
you take a look at urban employment, where Uber, Ola, Amazon, Flipkart, Zomato, Swiggy, and so many of these new companies, have they been responsible for a rise in at least part-time employment? Absolutely. But equally at the same time, I think the criticism that some of these companies have attracted is justified, is perhaps a strong word to use, but I hope they use this criticism constructively to try to figure out how to have better working opportunities, better salaries, better support systems for the workers that they hire. It's very much a question of two step forward and one step back. But I see the whole thing, without taking sides, I see the whole thing as a way for India to generate more employment, and that criticism, if it is used constructively, be used in a way to make the employment better. There will be problems, there will be crises, there will be mismanaged opportunities, and there will be cases where some companies have effectively done the wrong thing. But overall, if you step back and take the long term view, yes, it is an opportunity, but it needs better policy making also. So again, I think the theme where these companies are concerned and employment is concerned is cautious optimism. That's where I find myself.
Right. Yes, got it. So yeah, my next question would be: so is India actually facing this stagflation, where again at one point of thing we do see the traditional methods are not working, where India how it used to rely was build the highways and grow infrastructure around it, and that would in fact create jobs, but that actually doesn't seem to be happening as per the reports. So what are your views on that, sir?
It's difficult to tell if you're facing stagflation right now. And the reason I say it's difficult to tell if you're facing stagflation is because it's all but impossible to try to tease out how much of inflation is A, transitory, B, how much of inflation is related to food, C, how much of this inflation is related to the high rise of crude oil prices over the last 4 to 5 months, and much more importantly, how long these effects will last. I honestly don't know the answer to these questions. For about a year now, except for the height of the second wave, we have been reading reports about how the Indian economy may have well turned a corner. I don't think it has happened just yet. I think 22, fingers crossed, is likely to see better growth than both 20 and 21 did. But as a consequence, inflation might be slightly on the higher side as well. So, stagflation, probably not. High inflation, yes. And high growth, I see good chances this year. So I would tend to disagree with the idea that we have stagflation, but that's not to say that we are out of the woods just yet. There are problems, but not as bad as the last 2 years were, and I hope I'm right about that.
Sure, hopefully, sir. Again, recently we read about where India has actually become a $3.1 trillion economy. So
Mhm.
yeah, I believe the next question would be, are we on our way to achieve the $5 trillion economy by 2024, 2025? If not, I mean, how, and if yes, then how? Basically, that's the question.
Well, the math is a little difficult to get around. And unfortunately for all of us, whether it is a media, whether it is a politicians, or whether it is the Indian public, the math does not and cannot lie. If you want to go from a $3 trillion economy to, I'll keep the math simple, to a $6 trillion economy by 2000, say 25, that effectively means that we have to have growth rates of 24% over the next 3 years, which is just not going to happen. It's impossible. So I don't see us becoming a $6 trillion economy by 2025. And for that reason, I don't see us becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2024. So are we on the way to being a $5 trillion economy? Yes. Will we achieve it by 2024? No. And I don't see how I can be wrong about this because, like I said, the maths doesn't lie. But rather than worry about whether we will meet these particular targets or not, I think a better question to ask is what can we do to increase the rate of growth? PLI, which you've already asked about, and a couple of other schemes are steps in the right direction. So rather than focus on the achievement of the targets, I think we need to focus on what we need to change in order to maximize growth as soon as possible. But that I think is a better thing for policymakers and politicians to think about rather than treat each other as opponents about whether we will become a 5 trillion economy by 2024 or not. We will not. But that shouldn't stop us from trying to grow, get there as quickly as possible.
Right, sir. So again, which are the sectors that need to be focused, I mean, to actually achieve this target? Say, I mean, if not by 2024, but probably again bring it up by 2026, 2027. Which are the focus that, I mean, sectors that actually need the major focus now?
A major growth sector, both for employment and in terms of output, has been construction. And if you want to take the broader view, therefore, I would say focusing on policies that get urbanization and the incentive to drive urbanization higher, not just in the bigger metropolises, but I would argue across India's largest 20 to 30, maybe even 50 towns, is one thing that we should focus on. Number two, get manufacturing right. And to get manufacturing right, better land reforms, better labor reforms, and better push factors outside of agriculture. So there's been a lot of criticism of the farm laws. The intent was right, and hopefully we can get some sort of movement back on trying to figure out how to get more people to leave agriculture, because right now roughly half of our population producing 14% of our output is arithmetic that simply doesn't make sense for India. So get land reforms right, get labor reforms right, liberalize as much as possible of the ability to raise capital, which we've already done a fairly good job of, and get urbanization right would be the four things that I would want our country to focus on.
Right, sir. Thanks for that. So I actually came across a report where it said the population age of India, is expected to rather stabilize in a few years from now.
Yeah.
So the India's current median age is at 28. When you compare that with European countries like Germany, it is around 45, 48 or something like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
How will this actually have an impact? Because the one thing that we actually keep saying that India's young population and what do you see? I mean, how do you see this actually having an impact down the line?
It's a golden opportunity that is never ever going to come back. Over the course of the next 3 decades, India's population is going to be mostly of working age, mostly at an age which has a high rate of reproduction. And getting employment opportunities right, growing India as quickly as possible over the next 30 years is quite literally India's biggest challenge in the last 100 years. If, say, for example, by 2047, 100 years after independence, you want India to either be or be very close to being a developed country, getting our policies right is imperative. And if we fail over the course of the next 3 decades, we will have failed forever. Because trying to generate employment for 1.5, 1.6 billion people is not going to be easy at all. So that is, I would argue, the most important question of them all. And if anything, we should work backwards from this question in order to make use of the demographic dividend that we have over the course of the next 3 decades. We need to get each of your preceding questions absolutely right. There ought to be a greater sense of urgency amongst all of us, because the next 30 years are now or literally never. And I don't see that urgency across all sections of India's population, whether it is the public, whether it is policymakers, whether it is a government, or whether it is a media. I think we focus on everything else except the one big key question: how do you drive greater growth in this country? I wish there was more discussion around it.
Right, sir. Well, again, a follow-up question for this is, have we, again, has the productivity actually increased during COVID-19? I mean, everyone keeps saying, okay, the productivity has increased because everyone working from home, they would have more time to spend with their family as well as more time to spend on the system. So that productivity paradox, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, sir? What kind
I
of numbers
honestly
do you
don't
think
know.
that?
I really don't know the answer to this question. So, have we, well, commuting times have gone down, which is good. We are all able to spend, as you said, more time with our families, which is, I would say, not necessarily good from the point of view of productivity, but it certainly is good from the point of view of mental health and physical well being. Are we more productive at home? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. So Nick Bloom has done great research on whether people who are at home are more productive or not, whether being away from your colleagues actually helps you work more or not. I would tend to think no. There is something intangible but very real when you are with a bunch of people in a room working together. And sitting in your own room, just for me at least, doesn't cut it. So I don't think we are necessarily more productive, but I think we are spending more time in front of our screens. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose we are about to find out in a couple of years or so.
Sure, sir. Thanks for that, sir. Well, couple of other final questions. So, what are your thoughts on the upcoming budget session, sir? Like, what needs to be, what needs the actual focus as of now? I mean, from the government and as from the population point of view. Yes, sir.
I am very interested in understanding where our fiscal deficit stands in about 15 days from now. We finally, after years, acknowledge the mountain of debt that the Food Corporation of India has incorporated. And having acknowledged that was a good step towards trying to correct that anomaly. So I'm very interested to see. We have, if I remember my numbers correctly, we are slated to have had a fiscal deficit of 6.8% this year. My personal hunch is we will exceed it by a little bit, maybe 7.5 or so. So I'm very curious to see that. Second, I'm curious to see what kind of support the government announces for especially the rural sections of the population and those that have had to, in a sense, go back to their villages over the last 2 years or so. So what kind of support schemes are announced is something I'm very interested in. And finally, anything that complements the PLI scheme. So announcing the PLI scheme is a good start, but announcing schemes that support it in terms of building out infrastructure that you really need to have a vibrant domestic manufacturing sector, schemes or policies along this line will be something that I'm personally hoping for. This is deliberately a broad and vague answer. So once you get into the specifics, you need to start talking about it from each sector's perspective. But broadly speaking, these are the three things that I want to learn when I listen to the budget this year.
Right, sir. Well, one final question, sir. So, as a retail investor, are we actually in a stock market bubble now?
I've been saying for 2 years that we are in a bubble, and the stock market seems to violently disagree with me. So I'm probably not the right person to ask this question. My portfolio is very happy. My knowledge of economics and finance is very sad because none of what I know has been working for the last 2 years. So I
Right.
think we are in a bubble, but well, I've been wrong for 2 years, so maybe I'll be wrong for another couple of years. Who knows?
And yeah, one ominous question. I mean, is this
Yeah, yeah,
bubble gonna
please.
burst? Will this bubble burst?
It has to burst at some point or time. A, If I knew the answer, I wouldn't tell you. I would want to make profits from knowing the answer
Right.
before anybody else did. But the fact that I'm teaching economics for a living, almost by definition, means that I don't know the answer. So there will be a crash. When that crash will be, God knows.
Sure, sir. Thanks for that. I don't have any further questions, sir. Swaraj, are you online? Uh,
Yeah. Any more
I guess we can
questions?
wrap it up then. Nothing from my end. You have any?
No, actually. So first of
Okay.
all, thanks again for joining us today.
My
It's
pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
even apart from the whole knowledge series and the admissions part of you, just having a conversation with you is a treat in any day and any time. And you must have seen that during your classes as well. We
Hmm.
usually keep on asking a lot of questions. We try to extend the lecture.
Indeed.
So
Indeed.
thanks again, sir. And what are your plans as far as the next year is considered? Like anything that, in terms of teaching or anything that you aim to do this time?
Try to figure out how to teach at scale. So rather than have only one class listen in, try to figure out how to teach as many people as possible is something I want to get better at this year. We'll find out in about 11 months about whether I've succeeded or not.
So I do
So
have one final question. So, what are your
Yes,
word of advice for the upcoming MBA grads?
figure out how to complement the machines that you're working with because they are trying to figure out how to substitute you. Is one useful piece of advice for all students. If you're working with a computer, trust me, somebody somewhere is trying to figure out if the computer can replace you. If that is what the world is going to look like over the next 30 years, automation is here to stay, then your career should be focused on figuring out how to automate better rather than trying to fight the machines. Is one useful piece of broad advice that I would not hesitate to give to anybody who's starting their career right now.
Yes, sir. And another just one last question, probably, if you may, if I may. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So
please,
you
please go
keep,
ahead.
so we keep asking you in the class. I mean, are there any books or movies that we can read to understand economics better? So yeah, a word of advice for the you viewers that we have now. Any movies, any TV series that you can recommend now?
I would say that economics is a way to understand life. And by that logic, I think watching any movie teaches you about life, and you need to ask what are the incentives of the people who are doing whatever it is that they do in the movie. How is this movie helping you understand that particular world better? So, if a movie is about the 70s or 80s in India, then what is it about the nature of relationships? What is it about the kind of jobs that people do? What is it about the kind of homes that they live in? What is it about the kind of story that is being told? Are useful questions to ask, and you end up learning about the economy by watching anything. So it could be a movie, it could be a television series, it could be listening to music, but asking why was this song or this movie or this series made when it was, and what does it tell us about the kind of opportunities that are available to people who come from that sort of society. For example, Breaking Bad. Why did Walter White have to do what Walter White did? What does it tell us about rural or semi-rural America? What does it tell us about family sizes? What does it tell us about opportunity cost? What does it tell us about the ability to leave a high paying job and whether there are enough support systems that enable you to do so? Is one way to analyze. I'm not saying everybody should always think about economics and watching Breaking Bad, but this was just an example. Anything that you watch, you should be able to understand more of the society that is being shown in that particular series. So watch all movies and always keep thinking at least a little bit about economics.
Yes, sir. Got it, sir. No further questions from my end, sir. My apologies, I took your time.
No worries at all. It was,
Even though
like I said,
asking,
a great lot of fun. Thank you so much for calling me.
yeah.
yes, sir.
We had a blast, sir. Thanks a lot, sir, for joining
All
in.
right. Thanks.